Wonderful. Are we morning or afternoon? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am here on short notice because the person who's supposed to moderate had an emergency, but it's, of course, a tremendous pleasure for me to be here. I work at the UN. I'm the Director of Coordination for the Department of Peace Operations and the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. These issues these days, issues of kind of emerging technology are, even in our very political, peace and security oriented world, obviously fundamental to what we do. So it's great to be here and with two very distinguished panelists, Ambassador Gafoor, the permanent representative of Singapore to the United Nations, and Mr. Markovski, who is the vice president, vice president for engagement, I believe it is at ICANN. And I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your work in a moment, so we don't need to spell out the acronym right now. So we're going to have just, maybe take about half an hour, 40 minutes to have to set the stage a little bit for this very large topic and try to hit some of the big picture themes. And then what I'd really like to do is hand it over to you, because I know you're eager to ask our panelists questions. So we'll try to save plenty of time for that. And I have to keep my eye on the time here. Oh yes, and I can look straight ahead and forget about my phone. Oh, okay. That's not helpful then. So keep me on time if we're running over, because I do want to make sure we leave plenty of time for the questions. So maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador Gafoor. You are Singapore's top diplomat at the UN, and you're also chair of the open-ended working group on information and communication technologies. Could you tell us a little bit about the work of this open-ended working group, what it's trying to achieve? And maybe I'll just throw in a second question that you can kind of tackle together with that. You're someone who's worked on political matters. I know you've negotiated on climate change, a whole range of issues. And I think diplomats in the room would be very interested in learning, having you describe what it's like to negotiate on ICT issues. How is this different or similar to other diplomacy that you've been engaged in?
Thank you very much, Fatemeh, and good afternoon to everyone. Delighted to be here at Columbia. Thank you for the invitation. So just to jump straight into the topic, I mean, the open-ended working group, of which there are many at the UN, I wouldn't say many perhaps, but several working on a series of issues. For example, there's an open-ended working group on aging. So the format of an open-ended working group is basically a mechanism to have intergovernmental discussions on a very specific topic. So the open-ended working group that I happen to chair is on ICT security. Fundamentally, it's working on norm setting and institution building. So these are the two clusters of issues. In terms of norms, we already have a framework of rules, norms, and principles of responsible state behavior. So it's a normative framework, if you like, that is intended to guide states as they behave in the ICT domain. So it's there as a reference point for proper behavior by states. The second big chunk that we are doing is institution building. By that, I mean we are discussing among countries what should be the shape and format of the architecture, global architecture, to deal with ICT or cybersecurity issues from the perspective of international peace and security. And the third piece of the puzzle is capacity building, or providing capacity to countries, because ultimately, internationally, you have a range of countries with different levels of development. So if we want countries to understand the threats that they face and have the capacity to react to them and understand the international legal requirements, they must be given the capacity, whether it's technical capacity or legal capacity or technological capacity. So that, in a brief summary, is what the open-ended working group is doing. Now, in terms of how this is different from other processes, I was a climate negotiator for 4 years. So, you know, Copenhagen, all the different conferences that you see. I didn't go to Paris, but I left the process just before Paris. Fundamentally, the dynamics are the same. It's politics, it's geopolitics, it's individuals who can either make a difference positively or negatively in any process. A lot of trust building, bridge building. But one difference is that, technology changes much more rapidly than the climate uh, uh, change reality, which is a slow onset event. Climate change happens in a very slow, gradual way, and the statistics are stark, but it's a slow onset event, whereas technology, AI, is not slow onset, it's rapid. So that makes it very, very urgent for us to adapt, work faster, build consensus. And that's where a UN process fundamentally is a challenge because things take time. So that's one of the big challenges we are dealing with. I think I'll stop there and then, yeah, take further questions when the time comes.
And maybe just a follow-up sort of on process. So the General Assembly set up this working group, and so the member states are members of it, but there are also other stakeholders who are involved in the process. Can you tell us how who they are, how that works? What is their role?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question. I think fundamentally, if we are talking about international collaboration, you need everyone around the table. Now, the UN is designed as an intergovernmental organizations, so governments are at the table and governments will have to make the decisions. But this should not prevent others from being at the table in terms of providing their expertise, in terms of their resources, and then on an issue like ICT security, which is very much about technology, you need the private sector at least to share its perspective. You need the academic institutions, you need the foundations, philanthropic foundations and other foundations, and civil society representatives as well, people who advocate for women in terms of how technology or digital technology impacts different segments of society differently. So I think you need a variety of voices, but this is where I think the challenge becomes very real at the UN because not every government shares the view about wanting everyone at the table. So who do you include? How do you include or bring them into a process becomes also a debate. But what we can all agree is that at the UN, it's governments who make decisions because the UN is designed as an intergovernmental organizations. But at the same time, I think we also need to accept that you need a variety of voices at the table who can contribute to our decision making so that we make the right decisions, so that we make decisions based on the expertise and the realities as seen by a range of people. This is where I think the UN can do better, needs to do better. But in the open-ended working group, which I chair, I have been able to bring a variety of voices to the table. Just last week, we brought in technology companies. Interestingly, Microsoft was there. Also, Huawei was there. So the big companies, not just from one part of the world, but from different parts of the world, sharing their expertise about dealing with this issue. So I think there are ways to engage with different segments, different actors, stakeholders, civil society. But this is a work in progress, and we certainly can do better on that front.
And maybe just to further contextualize this before I turn to Mr. Markovski. I work in the peace and security part of the UN. Multilateralism is definitely under attack right now. And yet there are these processes going on that maybe are a little bit more under the radar. They're not in the headlines every day. what, from your point of view, why is it important for the UN, the multilateral system? I mean, you've touched on this a bit, but what is the significance of having a process like this taking place in this multilateral context? And for you as chair of this process, I mean, your government presumably has its views, just like every government, but chairing this process, what are kind of the principles that you're that you're using to guide the process?
Thanks very much. I mean, the first general point, and since this is a very talented gathering of experienced diplomats taking a week off from Midtown, lucky you, I think the first point to make is that I think at a moment when there is a lot of fragmentation, geopolitical tension, we do need a multilateral system that keeps a certain level of trust and cooperation between countries. And I always remember what Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, who said that the UN was designed not to take mankind or humankind to heaven, but to prevent us from going to hell. So in a sense, the multilateral system has a very important role in maintaining, contributing, and strengthening to international understanding, cooperation, and also build peace. Now, we are not doing a very good job on the peace and security front, but that's not because the UN as a system has a design flaw. The Security Council and the veto is not a design flaw. It was not a design bug. It was a design feature in order to get the victors after the Second World War to come around the table, in a sense, to have a framework to share sovereignty to some extent while preserving each one's own sovereign rights in order to contribute to peace and security. So that's the first point. We do need the UN. Second, at a moment when we are facing a lot of tension, I think it is even more important that we identify very specific issues. Some of the issues may not be headline breaking, on CNN or the Wall Street Journal, but very pragmatic issues, whether it's social issues, sustainable development issues, water, access to fresh water, is going to be one of the biggest challenges facing humanity in the next few years. And cybersecurity and ICT security is one such issue. And so if we can find very pragmatic steps, bring people together, strengthen the normative framework, strengthen observance for international law, I think it's worth trying. Now, in terms of the principles, I mean, at the UN, anything that is inclusive works better because the UN is a universal organization. So we need to start from the principle of inclusiveness, bringing everyone around the table. And any proposal that says, I have a superior view and I'm going to impose it on the rest of the world, it's not going to work. And it's not going to be superior in terms of delivering optimal outcomes for the planet and for the people. So we need to be inclusive. We need to talk to people. We need to build bridges. We need to find solutions. So building consensus, finding solutions, I think those are, in a sense, that has guided me and Singapore because we are a small country. We do not want to impose our views, and we cannot possibly impose our views because we are too small. But we do believe that it is essential to have a multilateral system that's workable. And a multilateral system by design is designed to dysfunction to some extent because of the sheer diversity of views. So I think one must be careful about judging the multilateral system or the UN or not unfairly condemning it. I think all of you are involved in the work of the UN to some extent. So you understand, in a sense, you are insiders. But from the outside, the UN always looks like it's failing miserably, miserably. Um, I'm not saying we are succeeding fantastically either, but I'm saying that, it is a work in progress, because international peace and security is always a work in progress.
Thank you very much. That's a great way for us to delve in more detail into this this particular issue. And Mr. Markovski, I'll turn to you first before we get to some of the the differences of opinion that might be coming up in the context of the issue. So you're vice president at ICANN, and your website describes ICANN as a— you may not have looked at your website recently.
No,
but
I was
did
wondering
look
which
at it this
website,
morning.
because I have mine, and I was
Okay.
like, what?
Well, the one that I found describes ICANN as a not-for-profit whose mission is to help ensure a stable, secure, and unified global internet. Can you tell us what this means in practical terms, and why do we need ICANN?
Well, that's how much time do we have? Well, I mean, for those of you at the UN, if you haven't heard about ICANN, has anybody heard about ICANN? ICANN? Oh no, you must have come to one of our briefings then, because we do briefings actually for diplomats. The last one was in January. But ICANN is indeed a non-profit based in California, which coordinates all the domain names and IP addresses on the planet and protocol parameters. So in fact, if people haven't heard about us, that's good, because it means the internet is functioning. When you go on your computer or your mobile device and you put google.com and you go to Google, not to somewhere else, that means that we are doing our job. We do work with governments. We have the construction of ICANN is very complex. We do have a governmental advisory committee with 182 members, including some territories, so not only member states, and 38 intergovernmental organizations as observers. And there are also private businesses, academia, civil society, other technical community members, because ICANN is one of many organizations that keep the internet running. And but we're the only organization that actually has a government engagement team, of which I'm an interim head for the last year, which deals with governments, not necessarily and only the governmental advisory committee, where usually it's the telecom administrations and regulators, but we deal with the foreign ministries. So that's why I spent some of my time together with my colleague Alexei here at the UN, or we go to meetings of the International Telecommunications Union, UNESCO, WIPO, and other intergovernmental organizations that deal with issues that may touch on ICANN's mission. So we are very limited in what we can do. Our bylaws are very strict. We cannot do content or other types of regulation. We only have to take care of coordinating the DNS, the domain name system, and the IP addresses and the protocol parameters, so that actually the internet is interoperable and functions in the same way around the planet. Now, some people, and I'm sure here people can say, well, but I went to country X and the content I saw there was not the same content as when I was in country Z. And there is a very good example of that, which is Germany. If you're in Germany, you won't be able to have access to content which relates to Nazis and Nazism. So if you're in France, there is also a law there. A few years ago, you might have heard there was a case about Yahoo, who were having they were selling stuff online, and the French government came to Yahoo and said, well, you're selling Nazi memorabilia, this is not allowed in France. So Yahoo just stopped access to this particular segment of their website. This was, by the way, before Google, so Yahoo was the biggest search engine back then. And so there are many countries where, and that's the beauty of the internet, because the countries can decide what the internet will be in their territory, but they're never touching the technical underpinnings of the internet. So nobody has said, oh, I'm going to have my own domain name system, or I'm going to have my own IP addresses, because if you have it, then your computers are not going to be connected to others. And your citizens, when they travel around the world, will not have the same access to their home, like if you need to sign a document or something like that. So we pay attention to the governments because we understand that the governments actually are the ones who, including through the discussions in the format of the open-ended working group of the group of governmental experts, when they discuss cybersecurity issues, they may sometime have the unintended consequences of their work, which is was very visible a few years ago at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, where there were proposals that were directly impacting our work. So we basically had to go back to them and say, including talking to governments and say, guys, let's make a clear distinction. The ITU is doing this and we're doing that, and none of us is actually interfering in each other's work. And it took a while, but currently we have MOUs and we work together with the ITU in the Coalition for Digital Africa. We have projects, to capacity building and all the stuff that the UN actually has been doing through the UNDP and other programs. But we do it very narrowly with regards to the country called top-level domains and top-level domains in the countries where, like .Africa is something that ICANN created, or .NYC top-level domain that existed. And in 2 years, there will be another round of top-level domains. So we may see new top-level domains showing up, or maybe none. We don't know what the market would say.
A lot going on underneath the surface that we don't see. And as a in terms of this intergovernmental process, which you are a stakeholder in, and speaking maybe for ICANN, but even more broadly for other non-governmental stakeholders that are there, what can you, sort of to complement what Ambassador Gafoor said, tell us what is the significance, you touched on this a bit, but of having organizations like yours present there, and even others, private sector and so on, and also what do you see from the non-governmental point of view that can be achieved in this process?
Well, I mean, ICANN understands very well how the UN works. So, for example, we may be present in the room, but we understand that this is the UN General Assembly Rules of Procedure, so we may be limited to what we can say. In fact, the ambassador may remember a few years ago, there was maybe 2 years ago, there was a big gathering of many stakeholders and Microsoft and Huawei, and everyone was there and speaking, and they were very happy because they're talking to the governments. And then this was, I think, 2 days event, and then there was a closed event, and I was on the Bulgarian delegation, so I helped. I'm originally from Bulgaria. I help as much as I can, and I was witness how, when there is behind closed door, the conversation is a little bit different, including some of the things that were said in the first couple of days were taken out of context because a country or another country would take something being said and will use it for their own political agenda. So what we actually are trying to do, unlike other stakeholders, because you're right, there are civil society, academia, businesses. No, we really want to make sure that when the diplomats are behind closed doors, they have enough knowledge to know how the internet functions, so that when they make a proposal of some kind, a resolution or a report or something, they don't put something which may impact the technical availability of the internet. Now, in theory, that could become a serious issue. We haven't seen it in practice, because so far all these proposals that even I have witnessed have been, there are enough member states who are saying, wait, this doesn't sound right, or they would reach out and talk to us, including there have been cases in the group of governmental experts on cybersecurity, which was very close, strict, only the 15 and then 25 members with their advisors could be in the room, so it wasn't even open for other member states. I remember once getting a call from inside the room. Somebody said something about ICANN, which was actually incorrect. And I was able in real time to fact check and say, hey, this is not what actually has been happening. Here is what is happening. And they said, oh, okay. So we have a very good partnership with the governments at the UN and other UN agencies. And I think they understand now the value of having an interoperable, single, secure, stable, and resilient internet, because they have seen what happens if something breaks. A few years ago, maybe last year was it, Facebook was not available because somebody remotely configured some router at Facebook's headquarters, and to the extent they were not able even to get in the room physically to change then what they misconfigured. So we are not dealing with that, but if we make something wrong, this will have an impact on many, many levels. So we are trying, whenever we do something, I mean, there is an old saying which the internet pioneers like Windsurf and others who created the internet, say if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So we're trying to do things, and when we introduce new top-level domains, that's one of the biggest issues, especially when we talk about top-level domains in other scripts than Latin. For example, my own Bulgaria couldn't get for a few years .bg in Cyrillic because it resembles BR in Latin. So people were confused. They were saying, wait, how would we know that this is BG and not BR? BG in Cyrillic. So we had to, ICANN had to work with the Bulgarian government to make sure that, and I felt terribly miserable because I was at ICANN and the Bulgarian government was saying, can't you help? What is the delay? Because we're used in Bulgaria, if something is not working, you go and talk to someone and then it's fixed. But so you see, this is the very challenging task because the rules of procedure of the General Assembly are not going to change because of the internet. They can't change just for one topic. And we have to understand, and when we talk to other stakeholders, we are trying to explain, guys, you're never going to see us in outside of the UN with the billboards and screaming at the diplomats. We are working quietly with them. We're more or less, it's a very diplomatic work. I go around the world, for bilateral meetings, and I meet with foreign ministries and my colleagues also from the executive team. We do those meetings and we behave as diplomats behave. Well, sometimes we may have a T-shirt instead of a suit and a tie, but
Wonderful. So I'm conscious of the time, and I think I'm just going to ask one more question and give you both a chance, jumping kind of to what's at stake here in this discussion. Because this idea of the internet as an open resource that's obviously been an incredible tool in providing access to information, connecting people globally, enabling people to all over the world to engage in real time on issues that obviously was not possible before the internet age. And yet we see all around us the very serious risks that are there present as well. Misinformation, disinformation, the spread of hate speech. These cause real harm, and I know that in my work at the UN, we see this acutely in conflict settings and post-conflict settings. But really, it's a threat in any community or society where there might be divisions. So I'd like each of you to give your reflections on this. How do we balance this idea of the public interest in a common internet that's, a space that's governed by no one or by everyone? Maybe there's some technical, things that everyone agrees on, but beyond that, everybody kind of does it their own way. But because of the very real risks that we're seeing, how do we balance this against that instinct that, well, maybe we do need to regulate this a little bit more, and maybe there's a lot of bad stuff happening as a result of it. So I'd love it if each of you could speak to that a little bit, and what are the where do you see the debate going on this? What are the trade-offs, and where are we likely to go with this also in the coming period? Maybe I'll come back to you, Ambassador Gafoor, first.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think maybe we should be thinking in a very broader perspective, from a broader perspective, in terms of what kind of architecture or frameworks do we need to manage some of these challenges. So in some ways, the internet is a good case study because you have ICANN, which in some ways provides an architecture for the world to have one common internet. It's not 2 different or 3 different sets of internets. And that common architecture is essential for interoperability, meaning that there are 193 countries and people can access information or data through the internet, even if those information may be stored in another country, or even if the information is about another country. I think there are lessons to learn from that architecture, because we are now grappling with the issue of AI and whether we can have a global architecture that will allow for interoperability, that will allow for data to be shared and transferred. If we don't succeed in that, you might end up with systems that are, some people say, bifurcated, meaning split into two. It's a technology Cold War where two different systems, or it could be worse than that. We could have three different systems. And such an arrangement can be driven by geopolitics. In fact, geopolitics is already pushing, and you would have all read and heard about technology wars or differences. And so if people started building walls, then you may have a bifurcated technology architecture, whether it's AI or other issues, or even the internet may be split in the future. And that will not be a good outcome for the world, for all our people, all our countries. As part of that architecture, we also need to think in terms of what each countries can do and must do, because the internet does give everyone the flexibility to have our own national regulations. So in the case of France and Germany, it's Nazi propaganda. In Singapore, we've always taken a very strong view about harmful content on the internet, hate speech, anti-religious remarks, because we are a multiracial, multi-religious society. And even as we respect freedom of expression, I think we see the need to remove harmful content if it's directed against specific religion, cultural groups, and a variety of other harmful content. So my point is that the internet in some ways offers a good case study of how we have managed it. And it is a result of organizations like ICANN. What is the equivalent of ICANN for AI? Ask yourselves. Do we need an equivalent of an ICANN for AI so that the AI space is able to be optimized at a global level with a single framework? But that should not prevent individual countries from doing what they need to do to protect privacy, to prevent harmful content, but also to promote innovation, because we don't want too much innovation such that, private enterprises are prevented from innovating. But at the same time, private enterprises are driven by profit maximization. Governments have different national objectives. And as the international community, we must also think in terms of what works best for the international community at the global level. Now, this is where the debate is very live. Some people are saying we don't need anything at the UN, or we don't need anything globally. Let it be as it evolves. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. We don't need global regulations. Others are saying, no, the UN must control everything on AI, for example, or control the internet, for example, which is also not going to be possible because it's driven by private enterprises. Technology cannot be controlled by a resolution being adopted at the UN. So I think we need to balance the need for some degree of international cooperation and coherence in order to achieve common objectives as an international community. That's where we need to manage the politics or geopolitics, strengthen levels of trust or rebuild trust in some cases, but also allow for private sector and public partnerships to happen, private sector innovation to continue, regulations at the national level as countries see fit, and interoperability of the system. So so many thoughts are coming to me. So I hope I have been coherent myself. Thank you.
Thank you. It is there's a lot packed in there, and I hope we can get to some of it in the Q&A. But over to you. And you added, I raised the kind of the free speech, misinformation, disinformation. Of course, there are privacy concerns. There are all the host of human rights issues that come up with AI. Given all of that as a backdrop, what are your reflections on that?
Well, first of all, one thing that some of the people here whose English is not native would understand it is that in some languages, governance, when you talk about internet governance, the word governance only relates to governments. So you can't have governance without a government. On the other hand, you have a definition built by a special committee appointed by the Secretary General called Working Group on Internet Governance from 2004-5, 20 years ago. They created a definition which is widely accepted. It's then reconfirmed in the so-called WSIS, or World Summit on the Information Society Tunis agenda. I highly recommend for anybody who is into the second committee at the UN or related issues related to ICT to read it, if you haven't, because the WSIS Tunis agenda and the WSIS plus 10 outcome document, which was negotiated 10 years later at the UN, basically provide the foundation, the internationally agreed foundation for governance of the internet. What we are talking here about AI and content and stuff, this is actually on top of the internet. So we tried for several years to talk about technical internet governance, trying to make a differentiation between what people understand by governance of the internet and what we understand as technical community. Because the ambassador is right, we are trying to keep the internet interoperable, and we see every once in a while there are some attempts or some ideas being pushed by certain governments saying, oh, we don't like this current model of internet governance, of governance of the internet. We think, including, by the way, countries who have representatives on the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN, who are going and publicly stating stuff which is not correct. I was actually at the OEWG, was it last year or 2 years ago, in March, I think in March 22, when the Russian Federation, and it was publicly webcast, so I can share it, said, well, ICANN can shut down our internet, so we think it's bad. Even though this was only a few days after ICANN actually has, in writing, together with other technical organizations, responded to a request by the Ukrainian government. If you remember, this is 22. The Ukrainian government asked ICANN and other organizations to strip Russia of their top-level domains and IP addresses. And we responded that we cannot do that. Actually, I think there was a line in the letter from the ICANN CEO saying we're in the business of keeping the internet running, not breaking it. And the Ukrainians were not happy, but people realize that we're actually not an organization that can do something which is not in our bylaws, and it's not possible, like technically possible to do. It's not like ICANN has a button, where we can press it and the internet will stop working in one country or another. In fact, those of you who have been around during the, let's say, was it 2011, the Arab Spring, so-called, in Egypt, they turned off the internet, and that was not, it didn't have any impact on anything that was developing in the country because the internet was not impacting what was happening. So countries realize that the internet can be used for good. And of course, there are cyber criminals, etc., but they use everything. So they will be including using the AI regardless of the controls. But it's a challenging thing with new technologies when they show up. Countries jump, governments, some of them say, oh, we need to control that. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, in Bulgaria, there is no control whatsoever over anything related to the internet. And the result is stunning. With 6.5 million people population, at some point now, not so much, but at some point we had more than 2,000 internet service providers. I mean, imagine if Manhattan, if we had so many, we would have fast internet at very low price. Instead, we have kind of okay internet and we pay a lot. So I think that's one of the lessons where if you keep in touch with the community and if you engage them, and that's what actually that's how we solved it in Bulgaria. The government introduced licensing for the internet service operators, and we sued them. I was on the other side. I was suing the government. And the prime minister gave up after 10 months and reached an out-of-court agreement with us because he said, you made the worst possible thing for any politician, which is you had a problem, you, the internet community, had a problem, and you managed to make it my problem because we were every day in the media, publishing stories, talking to foreign officials, like German Chancellor visits Bulgaria, and somebody of us is asking him, what does he think about it? And of course, he says, oh, I don't see any economic reason to license the internet. So you see, there are ways to, and I think partly, by the way, the OEWG and other parts of currently there is a conversation going about the Global Digital Compact at the UN. the co-facilitators, the chairs, they try to bring others because they realize that if you don't bring everybody and you just do something with governments only, you are losing the expertise of the people who you may need in the room, one, but two, you need to persuade the population that what you're doing is good. So, I mean, these are the UN is changing slowly. ICANN is changing even slower in some cases, but you know, we need to talk to each other, all stakeholders.
Thank you very much. With that, I am going to open it up for questions right now. I think given the amount of time, maybe we'll take a couple of questions and have you each respond to them, just to use our time as well as possible. If you could introduce yourselves and where you're from, that would be super.
Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Dimitri from the UN Secretariat. You've partially alluded to this already, but there's this issue of countries, quote unquote, trying to reestablish sovereignty over their internet. How do you feel about this issue? What challenges it poses? And yeah, if you could speak to that, thank you.
Hi, I'm Eder from the Mission of Peru. It's a similar question, actually. I was listening to ICANN presentation mentioning that sometimes member states might come with creative ideas at UN for different UN forums that might affect the availability of internet. Of course, maybe not necessarily to mention a specific country, but during this time, like which kind of proposals that were discussed in international intergovernmental forums like have arise and maybe like they have been reconsidered after receiving technical advice by ICANN. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, I on the sovereignty question, yes, there are countries even, you know, again, Russia has published a whole law. They have a law for Russian sovereign internet. But they require their internet service providers to have specific code in their routers and servers, which could be activated in the case of, you know, some major breakdown of the internet. But the reality is it's still the same internet. It's still the same TCP/IP, the protocol that is running the internet. It's still the same HTML that, you know, the websites are built on. So as long as the domain name system and the IP addresses are coordinated globally, every country can do whatever they want because this is the sovereign right of every country. In fact, the Tunis agenda that I mentioned talks about the sovereign right of countries over their country called top-level domains, and the other countries should not interfere in how this is being managed. So I think, again, to me, this is more of we need to talk to each other. We need to explain how the internet is working because in some cases, and I know them very well. I was actually before this current job, I was VP of ICANN for Russia in the CIS countries. So I know the language, I know the culture. I've talked to them, and when I talk to them, to government officials, they're like, "Oh, we didn't know that," or "Oh." So their policy have changed dramatically, actually, in some ways, not necessarily in a negative for the internet way. The fact that the internet continues to thrive and continues to develop, and everyone participates, regardless of what's happening politically, you know, between countries. There is every country that wanted to be on the governmental advisory committee is on it. A couple of islands are not there still, but they participate in the development of the domain name system. They participate in the policies that are being approved by ICANN, so they could have their say. And again, you can go back, for example, and check the headlines from few years ago about .amazon, the top-level domain, and how the countries around the Amazon area, you know, were responding and were having argument. And I'm sorry, the second question was
that sometimes member states have raised proposals in UN forum, in intergovernmental forum that might have affected the availability of internet. So no need to mention which, but maybe to know like which kind of proposals, or like if after briefings by ICANN they were like kind of reconsidered.
So first of all, as you know, because you're spending time at the UN, I'm talking about the informal informals. So they're not really proposals that are brought officially at the formal meetings. And I, again, having been there in these rooms, I've been able to talk to the people and explain, because I mean, I can give you an example. And it was completely unrelated, by the way. It came out of the blue, but we will see more of it next year during the WSIS Plus 20 review, which will happen at the UN in October, November, December next year. So whoever is going to be the co-facilitator of this, I'm not envious at all. Actually, if you don't like somebody, you may propose him or her to be the chair. They're going to have a really tough time. Because this is where most of the strange proposals will come. But at the end of the day, the UN works on they don't want to go to a vote for something that impacts everyone, you know. They want to reach consensus. I mean, the OEWG has to reach consensus, because if one country doesn't agree with the chair's report, there will be no consensus. So that means you have, and the same is true for the Global Digital Compact. So there have been proposals, including there was one proposal years ago that the UN General Assembly should call ICANN to change its bylaws to allow veto power of the Governmental Advisory Committee on the decisions of the ICANN board. And I said, look, I'm going to speak as a lawyer here, because that's my background. You understand this, first of all, these Juncker resolutions are not binding. But secondly, and then I was in a private conversation with the diplomat, I said, who is going to be the one to put this veto in? He says, well, the chair of the GAC. I said, well, if the chair of the GAC is from a country that you don't have good relations with, and it's an issue about your country, and he's like, oh, I haven't thought about it. And because it was, I think it was a proposal which wasn't consulted with the capital, so he was basically, I don't need to, you know. So I think there are these examples where you can see, and that's the beauty, I think, of the diplomatic work, where when we do those briefings, and we're going to do the one in January, we had more than 100 people, both in New York and in Geneva. We'll do more in the coming months, because this is where you can learn a lot about how the internet functions, if you didn't know it, but then it will give you the tools to negotiate with better prepared, you know, because when you hear something like that, you'll be able to say, wait, that's not how the internet works.
Well, I think Veni has covered it, but I just want to make a broader point, which is that the notion of sovereignty is not incompatible with global governance. And therefore, when we talk about global governance, whether it's the architecture or the institutions or the rules, that does not mean that, you know, countries are forsaking their sovereignty. In fact, global governance is only possible if the architecture assures countries that their sovereignty will not be compromised unless they've specifically agreed to certain areas in which they will be governed by certain global rules or global institutions. And therefore, I think the whole idea that countries want national sovereignty over the internet versus a global institution to manage the internet, I think it's a binary debate in my view, and that does not always help. These kinds of binary sort of approaches don't always help find solutions at the UN, because inevitably the reality is more complex than that. So I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yes, hand over there. If you have questions, put up your hands. Maybe we'll take a couple more and get answers in the last minutes that we have. Go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me, Wesley Bogatz from the Belgian delegation. Let me see if I can structure my thoughts and try to frame them into a question. I think first, it's important to see the inherent differences between the global internet and AI sort of conceptually. I think AI uses the internet for much of what it does. It's sort of a layer on top, if you will, and therefore uses the internet and relies on ICANN and the nuts and bolts working and being interoperable and remaining so. Maybe if I may, to kind of further the question that was posed by Ambassador Gafoor, what is the ICANN of AI? Today, potentially ITU does a lot of the work as it comes to standard setting and those nuts and bolts. To come to the question of governance, and do we want governance, and what does that look like? I take the point on the WIS's definition on governance, and that expands governance to many more stakeholders than government, and I think it's good to have a broader conversation about what are desirable outcomes. Of course, desirable outcomes, societal outcomes in terms of how do we deal with content, how do we deal with access, those are not things, and I do stand to be corrected, of course, but those are not things that ICANN deals with. That is not the technical underpinning. Those are policy outcomes. And in that sense, noting that the way that the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, functions, and the many stakeholders there present, there are many discussions, none of them are binding. And so in a way, there is a confusion in the sense that we talk about that as being Internet governance, but no legally binding decisions are made there, so we're actually not governing the internet, which is fine, and I'm happy with that. Many states are happy with that, some are less so. The only way that that governance comes into effect is if such discussions in international fora should lead to particular views, consensus among states, they could translate those into national legislation in a way. So then the question becomes, if we do want governance on AI because we recognize that there are existential threats for us as a society, those are then, that speaks to policy outcomes more than nuts and bolts. So that speaks to wanting something more as a platform than what ITU does today. And we have a variety of platforms. We have AI for Good Forum from UNESCO and a number of others, but those are not today, binding. So what would you then see as an adequate forum for such a discussion? And maybe that's for Ambassador Gafoor, because that would be policy more than nuts and bolts. Thank you.
Have a couple more hands. Should we just, I'm just afraid because we're short on time that you might be able to condense your answers to a couple of questions. Otherwise, we're not going to take any more. So
To catch it.
okay. I'm sure we can run over a few minutes because there are a couple of hands here. So please go ahead.
Thank you. So Chloe from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have two short questions. The first one, please forgive my absence of technical knowledge on it, but on this aspect of governance of the internet, to what extent, because you've been speaking a lot about domain names, to what extent does and can that cover deep and dark net aspects? And the second is about this, coming back to bifurcation and the risk of the splitting. You've mentioned that Russia has sort of side plans in case to prepare it, but technically it sounds unlikely. What is the probability for us to see in the next 10, 20 years, a separation of splitting of the internet?
Thank you. Sarah Renthoff-Smith from the Danish mission. So one of my questions was the last one there, but I'm curious, you talked about, Veni, how, we need to, as we discuss policies, understand how the internet works. I wonder also, as human behavior becomes apparent, how people use the internet for good and for bad, how ICANN has evolved its approach, if at all. Have there been any major incidents that led to you taking a different approach? So think more of it as a social technical system where, not just the behavior has to change, but maybe also how the nuts and bolts are structured. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena from UN Secretariat. I was wondering how each of the work, so the Open Working Group and ICANN, how do the discussions in those contexts connect to the bigger discussion maybe of the global digital divide and the right to the internet, etc. Because we talk about global governance, but then there are still millions of people who do not have access to it. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank you. So is it possible to split the internet? I mean, it's possible, but on the technical level, it's very unlikely because nobody has ever tried it. And even what I was saying is, like, in the case of some major breaking of the internet, which so far for so many years the domain name system has always worked. Now, the good thing is, as I keep on saying, we're like the phone company. You never call the phone company to say, hey, my phone is working, thanks. But if you don't have a signal, for some reasons, you will find somebody else's phone and you will find, you know, the contact phones for your phone operator, and you'll start calling and say, what's wrong? So the reality is that the DNS is one of the services on the internet that has always, the domain name system has always worked. And in some cases, if something doesn't work for some reasons or another, it could be misconfiguration or anything like that, but it's always a human error that has caused it. It's not like the technology. Also, we keep on introducing new services, like there is an extension of the DNS called DNSSEC from security, which makes sure that nobody can stand between you, the user, and the web service provider, for example, or any other provider, and imitate that provider, so that because it used to exist in the past, before DNSSEC was introduced, somebody can stand between you and the website and pretend it's them. And there are technical solutions to that. But the fundamentals of the internet have not changed. This is all we are building on top of something which, by the way, as Vint and Bob Kahn and others who created the internet keep on saying, is they never intended this to be around the planet. That's why the IP addresses initially were 4.2 billion, because they thought that's like, it was early 70s, that's more or less the population of the planet. So yeah, we can have like 128 networks, more or less the number of countries back then. So it expanded. So now you have IP version, Internet Protocol version 6, which has so many IP addresses that practically every atom in the universe, every sand piece on the planet can have its own IP address. I mean, I love this visuality. If the IPv4 addresses are as big as my fist, all of them, 4.2 billion, the IPv6 address space will be as big as the sun, the actual sun, not the sun that we see from here. So it's huge. I mean, everybody can have, so these are technical solutions that we come with. And so we'll see. On the human behavior and how ICANN has involved through major incidents, we, in particular with regard to the root servers, which are the technical servers around the planet that maintain the domain name system and IP addresses and stuff, there was an attack a few years ago, many years ago now, on all of them at the same time. And I think back then there were only 13, and out of them like 6 stopped working because of this distributed denial of service attack. And then the engineers figured out, oh wait, we need to have actually copies of these root servers around the planet, and that's the result of it. I mean, any country can have a copy of a root server, a mirror copy, which means it changes at the same time the original ones change. And that immediately made it impossible now to get today. If you take the whole internet traffic and you try to aim it at the root servers, they will still maintain and continue to work. And then the last thing was how the discussions connect to the digital divide and connectivity. I mean, I can only speak very briefly about ICANN because this is not our primary focus, but we do think about connecting the next billion. We work with the ITU, by the way, not only in the Coalition for Digital Africa, and with UNESCO on multilingualism. And these are the top level domains that come in different scripts than Latin. So a few years ago, we started introducing them in any script that exists, in any alphabet that exists. So you can have .bg in Bulgarian, or you can have .Moskva in Russian, meaning Moscow, or .deti, which means children in Russian again, or in Arabic, in Chinese. In India, we have, I think, 11 or 12 country code top-level domains for the different ways of people writing the name of the country. So we'll continue with that program as it develops. And that's the way to make people who don't understand the English, and there are many who don't really understand the Latin alphabet, to be able to connect to the internet.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you do need to run right now, or if you have a few more minutes. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. Ambassador Gafoor, over to you.
No, thank you. I think Veni has addressed most of the questions. I'll pick up on a few themes. First, I think with regard to AI governance, where would be a good place to have that conversation? I think that precisely is going to be the subject of a debate this week in Singapore, where the high-level advisory board is meeting. But I think that we need to take both a vertical and a horizontal sort of approach. So vertical in the sense that some of the discussions relating to AI will take place in different sectoral or niche areas. So it's ITU, UNESCO, UNDP is also looking at it. Every different UN agency, organization, sector will have to address that. But there is also, again, I keep coming back to this notion of global governance. If you're a diplomat at the UN, I think this is a question that you need to think about very carefully. What exactly is the role of the UN? You can think about very carefully and come to the conclusion, and that's your right, that the UN has no role. That's fine. Then you have addressed that question in a diligent way and came to a conclusion. But on a horizontal plane, I think you are beginning to see different groups of like-minded countries having conversations. Those are needed, whether it's G7, G20, or different coalitions of countries. We will need, again, layers of horizontal discussions and coordination. So I think the question is, what is the role of the UN? I think the UN has some very specific roles, in my view, in terms of AI and peace and security. You know, the whole idea of weaponization and how we should prevent the use of AI for malicious purposes or weaponization purposes. AI for good, which is what the ITU is doing, how we can use it to advance sustainable development and also human rights and protect human rights. So I think some foundational rules or framework is needed at the global level. Where is that going to happen precisely at the UN? Which UN agency is too early to tell. But if we are serious about such a global normative framework or even an ethical framework, then that conversation must take place at the UN, and we must allow the space and time to have that conversation here at the United Nations, because that conversation will not take place anywhere else, because the conversations taking place outside the UN will have a different focus. I think that's the first point that I want to make. The second point I want to make is that there's also a debate about a legally binding approach versus a rules, norms, and principles kind of approach. And you know what's interesting? The same countries take different positions on these issues in different fora. So a country which is opposed to legally binding agreements in one area may advocate it in another committee for another area. But what is also clear is that the very large countries, they shall remain nameless, generally do not like anything legally binding, because anything legally binding will constrain them. Why would a very large country like to have his hands tied? So the question for the rest of us is, do we want legally binding instruments? Do we want normative frameworks? And do we foresee that norms can evolve into something more binding? I mean, all these are options. But all that I ask, since you are all part of a very prestigious leadership program, is that keep an open mind, take a pragmatic approach. Because ultimately, if we want to strengthen the multilateral system, then it's important and inevitable eventually that we have some kind of binding rules, even if it takes many years or decades. But to start a priori to say, I don't need any binding rules, it's a taking of a political position. And I can understand those political positions, and countries which do not want any constraints on their behavior may want such a position. So that's the other thing that I wanted to make. The last thing is on digital divide. I think the whole discussion on ICT security, cybersecurity, AI has just underlined the need for capacity building and closing the digital divide. I think, frankly, we've been having a lot of conversation about closing the digital divide, the connectivity issue, the infrastructure issue, the literacy issue, because it's not just giving people devices, but it's raising awareness, empowering them. I think it really needs to, in my view, be mainstream into sustainable development and the SDG goals. And I have been saying to my fellow ambassadors at the UN that if there's one thing that the SDG framework is missing is the digital dimension. Because in 2015, when we adopted the 16 goals, Agenda 2030, the world was different. There was no generative AI. There was a digital divide, but digital technologies did not have the opportunities. So the post-2030 agenda must be fundamentally about addressing the digital challenges, but also the digital opportunities. And that must start now, which in a sense is what we are doing, whether it's the Global Digital Compact, the cybersecurity, because the more digital you are, the more vulnerable you are to hackers, ransomware attacks, cyber scams. So you need to increase your cyber resilience, whether it's cyber crime or cyber security, that could lead to interstate conflict. So I think the whole question of the digital divide is something that needs very concerted attention at the UN, at the political level, at the policy level. And I'm hoping that the Global Digital Compact that we adopt in September will lead to that concerted sort of intense political attention that it needs and deserves, because otherwise people are going to be left behind digitally. People already are left behind digitally. So the question in 2030 is not leave no one behind, but make sure that no one is left behind digitally. And I think that's really going to be crucial for our work at the UN. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think I understand, Jean-Marie, that there is going to be a conversation later in the week with the UN Special Envoy for Technology and probably the Global Digital Compact. So a chance to follow up on this very, some of the issues brought up in this very rich conversation. And I can just say there's so much more to dig into here. We have to stop, but I think most of us are at the UN, whether you're a diplomat, staff member, because we believe in a norms-based world. And I find it personally reassuring that these conversations are taking place inside the UN, not outside, whatever, they're also taking place outside, but that they are taking place inside, whatever the challenges, whatever the outcomes. I think we all believe that that's a good thing. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for being on the panel. Thank you also. Very interesting complementary perspectives. And I think we'll stop there. Thanks.